Thank you so much, Catherine. And I apologize about the lighting difficulties we're having. Thanks everyone for coming. Those will go away as soon as I start sharing my slides, which I'm going to do right now. So here we go. Y'all see that? Okay, I've got a nod from Doug, so I'm going to say yes. All right, so today I was going to talk to you about how to think like a developmental editor. And I've been giving this presentation, as Doug says, over several years now at different conferences for Stanford's continuing education. And I think a useful place to start is to actually think about why we're talking about this in the first place. Like, this is only for authors a relatively recent concern. By relatively recent, I'm going to pin it at 2008. Because once upon a time, before 2008, this is the way that you would have gotten your work published. You'd begin with a manuscript, you'd go to an agent, your agent would go to an acquisitions editor, and when that piece was acquired, it would go through the editorial process, which a lot of authors don't know is broken into 4 parts mainly. You have what they call dev editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. And we will touch on what each entails. But what's important to know right now is that it was all done after the acquisition by the editorial team of the publishing company who bought your book. And then after that, it would go through design and illustration, permissions and rights, typesetting, formatting, production, the review solicitation, the tour building, the distribution, the marketing, and then it would go on sale. So as a quick overview, that's where it used to sit. What happened was that in 2008, the publishing industry really retracted in the Great Recession. And what has happened since is that there are more books, more titles being published now than ever before. But the editorial teams have not increased, okay? So it went from N to N minus 30%. It was about a 30% retraction. So we're at 70% of what the number of people who were handling the workload in 2008. And now the workload has increased by about 30%, but those people have not. And what has happened with that is that you see a different way of approaching that first stage of publishing. So now when your manuscript goes to an agent, it's so competitive that the expectation is that your manuscript is going to be very close to a publishable state. In the old days, you used to hear, you used to hear people talk about acquisitions editors and dev editors within a publishing house, and the expectation was that they would work with their authors and really bring these books on and develop their author's career, and they'd have a stable of authors. And that's just not how the industry is run anymore. There are 1 or 2 people who are an exception to this. There's like Robert Gottlieb, who still works for free, actually, for Simon & Schuster, just to keep his hand in it. He's one of the great editors of this in the previous century. And he does that, like he works with his hand-picked authors. But by and large, it doesn't happen. You're expected to deliver something that's very, very close to finished, because nobody really has the time to invest in it to the same extent. So you get this clean manuscript into the agent takes it to acquisition, the editor buys it. Then to answer a question that I often get asked, yes, it will still go through the publishing company's editorial process. So it'll get re-edited all over again. So some of those changes that you made early on will get changed again later. But in order to qualify for just this step, it just needs to be of a much, much higher standard. And this looks like an onerous thing to do before you even get to an agent, but really the most you can contract it, I feel, is that you can drop the copy editing. If you can get it dev edited, line edited, and proofread so it's clean before it goes to the agent, you're in pretty good shape. And we're going to talk at the end of this presentation about how you can do that. It doesn't always require big bucks. You don't always have to hire a professional. We'll talk about how you can actually get your work into the kind of shape it needs to be to go to an agent. So what is developmental editing? So you'll see in the far left column that dev editing is really the high, broad strokes considerations. You know, is the book working? Are the individual key elements working? And then is each chapter working? And have we filtered out all of the author's foibles? Those are the main considerations of the dev edit. Line editing is that all of these categories overlap slightly. But line editing kind of focuses way down on what the book is doing line by line. So author's foibles qualifies, but you also have the style, for example. Is the style fluid? Is it, is it elegant? Is this good writing? Is it efficient? Are the chapters flaccid, or are they getting work done? What is your language like? Is it poetic? Is it short and punchy? But is it consistent? Are we hearing one voice? And grammar, of course. Like, is this all being told in English that is good English? Assuming you're writing in English. Then in copy editing, which overlaps a bit, it is language, grammar, spelling, punctuation, consistency. So you see that it is much more technical. The copy editor doesn't usually ask whether it is a beautifully written paragraph. They worry about whether it's a correctly written paragraph, right? Two very different things. The aesthetic is really not their concern. And then the very last little step of this is proofreading, in which case you pay very close attention to the spelling, the punctuation, and the consistency. And those things are important. Don't underestimate them, because like I said, everyone is overworked, it's super competitive. A lot of the time, your work will go through a reader, either a volunteer or an intern, or in some cases, someone who's paid to read, but they'll go through a reader before they ever get to an editor or even an agent. And that person is tasked with not finding, well, they're not tasked with finding the next great American novel. They're tasked with getting that pile as small as possible, as fast as possible. So if you give them a few typos, you're out. You might have written the next American novel. If you can't punctuate it correctly, you've just given them some 21-year-old an excuse to throw it onto the reject pile. So be careful, make sure that your proofreading is well done. So let's talk about this broad strokes, high level stuff. Like what do we mean? What does a dev editor mean? And what should you be thinking about when you say, is the book working? The first question is there sufficient interest in this book? Dev editing is not necessary. I say this all the time to the people who come to me. You don't need a dev editor if you're writing for yourself, or if you're writing for art, if you just want to make what you want to make. In those cases, a dev editor can't really say anything to you that is more valid than what you yourself feel or think. But if you want to be published, which is a commercial venture, then the dev editor can help. And the first concern is there enough interest in this book for it to be marketable and for it to hold the interest of the reader so that it's marketable? And there are different ways of doing that. What is your conflict? Every book needs a conflict. And are the stakes high enough? Even if you solve this problem that the protagonist wants solved, what are the consequences of not solving it? If the only consequence is that they're going to miss lunch today and they'll have dinner later, then no, not enough for a book. So you need to look for high stakes, a very clear sense of conflict, and it basically answers the question, why should we care? As a reader, from the first page, why should we care about this protagonist and what is going to happen in this book? Oh, I've managed to go backwards. Hang on. There you go. And then the second thing to think about is tension and suspense. So that answers the question, why you turn the page, right? Even if I'm sitting with you and I'm convinced that your protagonist is someone that I want to spend time with, you still need to get me from page to page of a page turn. And the professional authors are really aware of this. Like I actually have a friend, she's published 17 novels now. And when she gets to her last draft, she throws it into this template so that she can see how it breaks in book format. So she knows whether she's ending kind of roughly at a critical point before the page turn comes. And that's, she writes thrillers, so it's especially important in thrillers, but don't forget to always ask yourself the question, why is my reader turning the page? Intrigue. Intrigue also binds us into a book. It's a little bit softer than tension and suspense. It might be things like an actual mystery. You open with a dead body. We want to know who that dead body is. It could be something like the world, that you just introduced to this world that is so different and so appealing and so, well, intriguing, to use the same word again, that you want to stay in that world. And it can also be your characters. If you make your characters interesting enough, we find them intriguing. We want to spend more time with them. We want to know what makes them tick. And all of these things, the intrigue in the book is what snags us or haunts us. When you put that book down, and most people will have to at some point, what is going to bring your reader back to the book? You need to snag them. Your book needs to haunt them. Talk to them in the shower and say, tonight when you come home, you should really not watch TV. You should pick up that novel again. That's what you need to feed into your book. And then the last thing is market appeal, because as I've said, it's a commercial venture that you're embarking on with a developmental editor. And it's important that the book is going to sell. And to do that, you have to understand why it will sell. So those are the big overarching elements. And then you kind of look at the key elements underneath those, like more specific things. Plot, for instance, pace, tension, structure, your characters, the world and setting, the point of view, what tense you're writing in even, and very importantly, which audience are you writing for? And, you know, there are 10, I give like 10-week courses on this, so we don't have time to do it all, but I thought I'd pick out 5 key ones for us to take a closer look at. And I'm also going to give you excerpts of actual dev edits that I've done so that you can actually hear how this work happens between an author and an editor. But let's first start with plot. So the first key element that needs to work, obviously, and where a dev editor can help you is your plot working. All the way through this, the thing that you have to remember is that no author can actually judge their own work. I just believe that that is fundamentally true. I've worked as a dev editor for, you know, maybe 10 years now. I can't judge my own work. I go out and I use a dev editor because you can just not see your work well enough. But there are ways that help you see it. One that's very popular right now is this book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. And she has a 15-point, she calls it a beat sheet, that if you're writing genre fiction, and that's my caveat, it doesn't work well for literary fiction, but if you're writing genre fiction, more or less your 15 beats should fall in. This is an abbreviated version that only has 9 beats. Okay, but this is probably right now the most popular kind of beat sheet that's being used out there. I'm a little bit more old-fashioned. I prefer something called Freytag's pyramid. And Freytag first came up with his pyramid in 1870 something, so you can see I really am very old-fashioned. But it's been modified since then. And so this is a modified Freytag's pyramid. You'll probably recognize a lot of the terms on this. So the book, it posits, starts with an exposition, like a little introduction where you set the world or you ground your audience. And then something happens, which is the inciting incident. And that picks up the tension. So it's called the rising action. Rising because the tension actually rises through this. And then it comes to a climax. And after the climax, there's a falling action where things having been resolved, you know, all the little bits fall back into place. And then the denouement at the end, which means, well, basically you ride into the sunset with Prince Charming and you see that wonderful last frame in your movie book. And it works really well to this day. It's been modified a little bit. This is what they call the modern phrase tags. And you see that the only big change is that instead of climbing to one climax, currently books tend to have reversals. So you almost get there and then you drop your protagonist off a cliff into more difficulty, and then they almost get there and then they get into more difficulty, and then you get your final climax and culmination, and then you're out. And two things to notice about this modern pyramid is that it reflects the very short attention spans we have these days. So the inciting incident is now way in the front, not a third of the way through the book, not, Anna Karenina, I said this at the conference the other week and got into trouble for it, but in Anna Karenina, the protagonist does not walk in until after 100 pages in my version. And so it's a very, very long exposition in the beginning. We don't have the time for that now, unfortunately. We have readers who are raised, who don't have a lot of time to read, and who are raised with a lot of other medias, a lot of other modalities that give them gratification much more quickly. So now the common rule of thumb is that you start at a point when life changes. You don't spend time saying this is what life is, and then this happened and it changed. You start at a point when life changes. And in every story, there are several of those points that it could be, but it's a pivot point. And then your out is very quick as well. Once you have your climax and your falling action that kind of ties up a few loose strings, you're out. The denouement is very, very short nowadays. So another way of expressing this, which I really like, is from John Dufresne's The Lie That Tells the Truth. And he puts it very elegantly as get your heroine up a tree, the tree being the big problem that your heroine has to solve, throw rocks at her, throw even bigger rocks at her, and then get her down, solve her issue. So you'll see that that's exactly this, where the rocks are the two cycles of reversal. So one of the main things that we do as dev editors is that we assess your books to see whether they're actually following this kind of arc and delivering this kind of expectation that your reader has as to how a story is told. It has a middle, a beginning, a middle, and end, and that there's going to be some like pitch or climax to it. Another thing that we look for is pace, and from here on, I'm going to use those real excerpts. So one way of thinking about pace is thinking about the magnet. So to this author, I said, I was once given this analogy and have since found it very useful. The end of a book should be like a powerful magnet. From the first page, you must be able to feel its pull, and as you read and get closer to the end, so its presence should be more palpable, accelerating everything towards itself. And it's an easy thing for you to apply yourself when you read your own work. Do you think you have this kind of magnet buried in the end of your book? In contrast, I said, your manuscript feels like a leisurely amble. The author does not appear to be in any great hurry to tell the story. The protagonist in the story did not appear to be in any great hurry either. Even on the eve of battle, they stop for long philosophical discourses or crack jokes that cut all the tension. The author is always in love with the world, right? I mean, that's why we're writing. So it's a very, very common mistake to just take your time because you're enjoying it so much. The reader is not so in love with your world. The reader's just been introduced to it. So it's actually the plot that needs to pull your reader through that book, that magnet at the end of it. Tension works in similar ways. Instead of a magnet, you can think of it as a clock. And I'm going to borrow the words of Alfred Hitchcock to kind of describe it and help you conceptualize it. He said, there's a bomb beneath this table. Boom! There's an explosion. The reader is surprised. But prior to this surprise, it has seen an absolutely ordinary scene of no special consequence. Now the bomb is underneath the table, and the reader knows it. They've just seen the anarchist put it in place. The reader is aware the bomb is going to explode at 1 o'clock, and the reader can see that it is 1:45. The reader is longing to warn the characters, there's a bomb beneath you and it is about to explode. That's how you add tension in there. And tension, as Alfred Hitchcock's perfect illustration shows you, is much more interactive for readers. It's much more involving for readers because the reader gets their own emotions like involved and actually wants things to happen and wants the pace to pick up and wants different outcomes from your book. So it's very involving for the reader. And then we come to the world and setting, and every book, even a contemporary novel set in your own town, every book has a setting. So there are different reasons, different ways that you need to pay attention to it. First of all, the rules and the logic and the consistency of a world have to be absolutely consistent. So in a novel like yours, setting means more than setting, it means world building. The reader will follow you into any world as long as there are some logical rules. And you'd think this is very obvious, but it so often does not hold up. They have to be applied consistently. So in this case, this was a book which actually has since been published, very successful book. What the humans know or don't know in this book is inconsistent. For example, the humans can blithely name a whole list of animals, mule, deer, bears, cougars, rats, a long list, but cannot name a large clawing blackbird. When it comes to skills versus book knowledge, they can knit, they can use a sewing machine, but they cannot drive a clearly labeled push-button automatic car. So it's little things like that that will wake your reader up from the world that you're creating, because they'll go, whoa, wait a minute, why is the car so difficult when you can just pick up a sewing machine and make that work? Also, this was shown in what the humans were surprised at. They're not surprised by everything they encounter in the complex, the shrapnel of life like staplers and coffee makers, not surprised by more unusual food like boiled crabs. They were surprised by hamburgers. So I was like, whoa, why were they surprised by the hamburgers? And then how they dressed. They were in dresses, shirts, moccasins, boots, flats. This book, though, spanned 6 years. There's about 30 young children who grow up by themselves. And so my question was, how do they keep themselves in boots as their feet grow, right? Every mother knows this is a problem. So if clothing them comes down to this one girl who was doing all the sewing on that sewing machine, does she have time to make dresses and shirts and slacks for everyone, or wouldn't she just put them all into tunics? So spend time in your head. It's alive and it looks very consistent. But where dev editor comes in is that we pick it apart and ask you some tough questions about the world you're creating. And then we also challenge that world on its accuracy. So in this case, in this scenario, the writer had actually described water gurgling through some vents, which to me meant that it had to be a very thin layer of water, because the gurgle comes from sucking air in as well as water. But later, it was much deeper water. So that was the first inaccuracy. Both things cannot be true. Also, it was the cargo hold of a ship. But she talks about her protagonist getting deeper and deeper as they walk towards the center line of the ship. Well, if you're going to design a cargo hold, you're not going to design one that slopes down into the middle, because how are you going to move your crates around? So it's little things like that that all of us need a second pair of eyes to have a good, careful look at, because it's alive in our minds. We're going to get it wrong. And then very importantly, also assess your worlds based on what they are communicating. They're not just passive settings for your characters and your plot. They actually communicate very important information. So in this case, I'm pointing out to the author that private spaces like an office or a home tells you a lot about the person in that office and home. So in this case, we know it's neat and that mom likes it neat. And we know mom works in a hospital. We don't know how. So is it humble? Is mom a struggling single mom nurse? Or is it very comfortable? Is mom a surgeon or an anesthesiologist? Or is it stuck in time because dad had died a few years ago? So has mom not wanted to change anything since dad died? All of these things you can take out of your setting and how you prop your setting. okay? And then we'll come to characters, which obviously they're difficult enough to write, they're difficult to evaluate, there are lots and lots of moving bits. First question then, who are they? They're alive in your head, but are they down on paper in a way that they can be alive to us? So I wasn't sure how insecure Linda was. Sometimes her self-esteem issues, especially about her body and appearance, seems quite pronounced. At others, she seems to be quite confident she'd be admired or found attractive. And I'm not sure how boy crazy she is. She doesn't seem to have many boy-focused thoughts until she, out of the blue, has very distinct, specific ones, like, I need to get a boyfriend. If she's boy crazy, I'd like to see that pervade and color her world instead of being siloed thoughts. Also, I'd like to see it affecting her reaction to Bobby, the male protagonist, and her good judgment, okay? So who are they? Are you getting down on paper what is alive to you in your head? And I get asked this often. Characters can be inconsistent. Humans are inconsistent. But the irony is that in writing, you have to make your characters' inconsistencies consistent. If they're just like random inconsistencies, we don't believe in the character. So then you might think that you're telling us something, but you might be actually telling us something else. So in this case, there was a character called Patrick, and the author had said several times that Patrick is very smart. But we need to see, this is the whole show don't tell thing. We need to see that Patrick is smart. So you need to put him in action, not just thinking about a plan, not just going through the motions of making a plan, but sharing his plan with us. And that plan needs to be detailed, smart, and watertight. And a lot of authors back out of this because they don't want to go to the trouble of coming up with that plan, whatever plan their protagonist has. And they end up instead just like giving us a few sentences about Patrick had a very smart plan. But the reader doesn't buy it. The reader wants to see it. You need to prove it. And so we also need to see small glimpses of him doing things that smart people would do. What do smart people do? They notice things that eludes other people. They make deductions or calculations more quickly than the rest of us. They anticipate things more than other people do. You want to have your character act out these personality attributes that you keep giving them. Show us, don't tell us, show us. And ask, is their behavior consistent with the emotions that you're trying to describe? So again, with Patrick, we were told that Patrick loves Lucy for her intellect. But if he loved her for her intellect and respected her, he'd discuss business decisions with her on an equal footing. The two worked together, but there was no discussion ever. Ask her advice even. We never hear them have one serious conversation, and telling us that they have them doesn't count. And Lucy has few speaking parts in meetings. In one important meeting, her role was to introduce Patrick, and at the end of it, she picked up the coffee cups. And small surprise then that she did not make the executive team, and despite his love and respect for her intellect, so we are told, Patrick never acted as if he thought she deserved it. So you have to put your characters on the couch, basically. Make sure that they are behaving and acting in a way that reflects what you're telling us about them. And last but not least, very important, do they deserve our company, right? For a lot of adults now with busy jobs and everything, a novel could be like a three-week commitment, a 3-week endeavor. So you have to ask, is your character good enough company for me to want to spend that much time with them? And I get asked all the time, does this mean that our characters have to be likable all the time? Well, actually, likable characters are much easier to sell. There's just no two ways about it. But you can also start with an unlikable character. In this case, I had a client who gave me a very unlikable character. I said, as you probably guessed, I have a big problem with Billy. It's not that she's sassy and disobedient, even rude from the get-go. She's independent and spirited too, with a sense of humor and an intelligent eye. And she's a good big sister to Mary Lee, so you look forward to liking her, especially if she learns a lesson, has a little humility. But as it turns out, it actually all goes downhill. As the story progresses, she crosses the border between sassiness and brattiness. She goes from being angry and vengeful to being mean. And then she goes beyond that even to being callous and calculating. Did I mention self-centered? So here is a really, really hard to like protagonist. The question is, easier to sell with a more likable protagonist? Absolutely. I'm not going to BS you on that one. But if you really feel that this is your protagonist, then what you need to do at least is let your protagonist change. Let your protagonist learn something. So I would like to see Billy learn. And God knows she can have enough opportunities. She has a grandfather who models both remorse and forgiveness. She has a father who does the same. She has a fight between mom and dad that you don't really follow through, but perhaps you could. And we could see how that fight got healed. We could see how sometimes it's more important to be friends than to be right. And Cammie, one of Billy's friends, could teach Billy a thing or two, as can Mary Lee with her sweetness, and as could Joey, who is the next baby. With his dependency, Joey could force Billy to think outside herself and teach her the unexpected joy of doing so. So if you have an unlikable character, and that character can learn and can have some self-reflection, has some humanity, then we will forgive that character and bond to that character. But you really need that aspect. And there is I can't remember the title of the book, but there's a book out there that has the most disturbing character ever. Like he's a pedophile vampire is what he is. And when I first started reading, I thought, how are you ever going to make me like this character? He is so loathsome. But because that character has some self-awareness and realizes that he is not a good person, and in one instance, only one instance, tries to make some amends, I think that the book works because you're able to see the humanity in this very, very inhumane character. So characters. So those are the big ones. And then as a dev editor too, as I said, we work on the chapter level as well. And the big things that we ask is, and this is very, very traumatic for a lot of our clients, we ask, is the chapter even necessary? Because first chapters especially, let me warn you, first chapters especially often not necessary at all. Often is the author kind of like getting comfortable and getting into that nice warm bath and getting ready to write. So is the chapter necessary? Does it advance plot and does it deepen character? At a minimum, I believe every chapter must do these two things, at a minimum. It has to move your plot forward. It has to deepen the understanding of your character. And if I was to choose one over the other, I would probably say that if you can really give me huge insight into a character, I might forgive the plot. I might forgive it if it doesn't. You actually never leave that room. But the other way around doesn't work very well. Does it ask a question that the reader needs answered? That's going to help your page turn. That's going to keep your book nice and tight and your attention taut. Does its ending pack a punch or leave us hanging? The last sentence of a chapter should have a certain ring, a certain tone to it, right? It shouldn't read as if you've just chopped off, you've just lopped off like part of your next paragraph. It should always end either on a punch or on a cliffhanger. Those are the two. Sometimes like on a note, like on a poignant note, but always some beat, something that you can hear in the end of that chapter. Then you ask yourself, is the chapter, is it efficient? Is it tight? And to make it efficient, you ask all these same questions of your paragraphs instead of your chapter. Is this paragraph necessary? Is this paragraph advancing my plot? Is this paragraph deepening my understanding of the character? And finally, even if that's a necessary chapter, is it in the right position? So An exercise that that I have a lot of my writers do, and that you can do for yourself, is to make a list of all your chapters. And for each chapter, I call this the post-it post analysis. And if you want more in-depth discussions to how to do it, it's on my website under my blog section, which is called Writing Life. But for each chapter, you do a little post-it note that just tells you what that chapter is, so that you can recognize that chapter. And you stick it on a wall, clear some paintings off because you're going to need a lot of wall space. Stick it on a wall, and then underneath that, you make a note of how that chapter has moved your plot forward and what that chapter has taught you about your protagonist, about the main characters. And I also put in what question that chapter has raised. Personally, when I'm doing this for other authors, or actually for my own novel, I will add a couple of questions that are pertinent for my particular book. So in my book, I have, for example, like a love triangle. So one question I ask myself of every single chapter is, where is the love triangle? Am I keeping track of that? Like, are her emotions going backwards? That's how I'm going to spot some inconsistencies. Where is the love triangle? How has that developed? And it looks something like this. This is about a quarter of the way through. Each one of those yellow post-it notes was a scene. I had, I think, 104 scenes, and it was done. The second row below hasn't been populated yet, and we're halfway through the first row. There's like more extending off the edge of the picture as well. And you'll see that the orange ones were what's happening with my plot. The yellow ones were what's happening with my character. Pink ones were what questions was I raising. Green was what's happening with the love triangle, and blue was what is her sense and feeling for home, because home's very important in this novel. And it's very painstaking work, but believe you me, you can see so many things quickly when you finally finish. And what I saw was, I started color coding them, and you can see all the little orange dots. The orange dots were dramatic scenes. And when I finished, you could see my saggy middle where I hadn't had an orange dot for like 10 scenes. And that's just, you can't have a book that sags that badly. So it just meant I had to go in there and just lop some of those scenes out to kind of go from one high point to another high point more efficiently. So that's a little exercise that might help. And then on the most micro level, I suppose, that a dev editor works at, we're looking out for your foibles. And everybody has them, and we all have several different kinds. So there are what I call author's conveniences, there's an author's uncertainties, there's rescuing our characters, which we all do, and then there are pet words and phrases. Author's conveniences, what do I mean? They're coincidences. So, and these are all real live examples, by the way, of books that went on to be published or are out with agents. They're viable books. This is not bad writing. This is just what good writers do. All of a sudden, your heroine has to get out of a locked room, and she just happens to see a key. For all of us sitting outside the book, we're like, oh my God, that was convenient. But if you're writing the book and you care about your character and you want to rescue your character, sometimes not. So the rule of thumb is you can use a convenience or a coincidence to get your character into trouble, but you can never use a coincidence or a convenience to get them out. The reader finds it very unsatisfying. And you've all witnessed those moments yourself, either in your reading or when you're talking to the movie screen going, well, that was bloody convenient that that just happened. That's exactly those moments that you're trying to avoid. Author's uncertainty. The example is a hero acting evasively, and it's not because he wants to hide how he feels or he doesn't know how he feels. It's because the author doesn't know how he feels. And for some reason, you can sense that. You can feel that in a book. You always can feel whether the author knows. In 10 years of editing, if I turn around to a writer and say, do you know what's going on at that moment? Do you know how he really feels? If I think the author doesn't know, the answer from the author is invariably no. There's like this sixth sense out there that you can pick it up. And the rule here is that the author must always know. right? Even if the protagonist doesn't know, the author must know. And even if the author does not write one word about it on the page, the sense of it will make itself felt. And that's called the iceberg phenomenon, that the unseen knowledge that the author holds will somehow make itself felt. You only see the very tip of the iceberg. Everything else is underneath it. And that's the other way of looking at that too, is that if you research a book well, and research can just be imagination. You can spend a lot of time and you've imagined out your book well. Even if you don't have to feel like you have to put all of it on the page. Because sometimes when you do that, it just bogs down. But the fact that you know all of these things will be in some strange way, because your details are consistent without you even realizing that they're consistent, because it just so happens that you know exactly what that street corner looks like. And so you're never going to misrepresent it or represent it two ways. It's going to make itself felt. So make sure you really know what's going on. Rescuing characters. Well, an example, and this is in a real life book that was published just in March. The heroine looked over a caldera, fell over the edge of a caldera, and I was reading this book. It's actually a really fun book. I was like, oh my God, she fell into the caldera. And he leans over and he goes, Lucy. And she answers immediately, I'm here. That's a rescue. That's a rescue. And it's very, very easy to do because we love them. They're our children. We don't want them to get in trouble. We want to take care of them. Don't. Leave them in danger. In fact, make the danger worse if you can. Make your reader worry about them. The more your reader worries about your protagonist and wants your protagonist to survive, the more bonded that reader is to your protagonist and to your book. And in the end, we read for emotion. We read to bond to characters. We read fiction that way anyway. So foibles, as I was mentioning, pet words and phrases, very, very common. Everybody has them. Everybody has a different set. There's more than one. These are all, as I look at this list, I know exactly which author I'm talking about. Just is me. I can put 3 justs in one sentence if I let myself. Quirked was one of my students who kept having people quirk their lips at each other. And Beard was another writer just published this year who every time there was any motion in the car, or the cars were always veering, or if she was walking somewhere, she was veering. Squealed is another published author that I work with who had her protagonist squeal all through the book. And I think by the time I hit the 3rd squeal, I wrote, enough squealing. Don't want any more squealing. And then I have an author that I'm working with right now who says, and now all the time, and it can sound good, and now can sound good, and now the wind came crashing in, blah, blah. But then 2 paragraphs later, it'd be, and now, same thing again. So pets by themselves, you use them once, they're perfectly good words and phrases. You use them more than once, you use them 3 times, they're now a pet. You're doing it way too often. And then there's also cliched phrases and gestures. And these are the things that they don't belong to you. They're not your pets and quirks. They belong to the greater humanity, and we've all used them. We've all seen them used to death. If we're very good writers, we don't use them. You should stay away from them. Eyes widened, smiled, shrugged, frowned, raised an eyebrow, heart melted, pulse raced. These I just picked out of some work that I've been working on just recently. I remember once I was working on 6 pieces of writing at the same time because I was workshopping 6 students, and eyes widened appeared in all 6 submissions. It's just way too common. You're a better writer than that. Each and every one of us, we're better writers than that. And to help, my big question is, what would Helen Mirren do? Because I hear all the time, well, she really would have smiled, or she really would have shrugged, or she really would have raised an eyebrow. Yes, absolutely. The cliches are cliches because they're actually true at some level. But get yourself a really great actress like Helen Mirren and watch her. She won't just smile. She'll do something else. She'll gather her gloves. She'll straighten the hem of her dress. She'll, go to the window and like put it up. Or what would Helen Mirren do to express that emotional state that she's in? So that is a recap of all of what dev editing entails. And now I'm going to go quite quickly through how you can help yourself do some of this work. How to get started by yourself. Well, you've already started because you're in this workshop. Learn the craft from the dev editing standpoint. You can do that in person, classes, conferences, obviously. Now is a very good time, by the way. COVID-19 is actually, if there's any kind of good thing to be said about it, it is that it's made all the writing conferences go online. So now, without flying to New York and paying New York hotel bills, you can actually go to like a writing conference in New York, and you can access the New York agents, and So bear in mind that for this year and maybe next year, all of these writing conferences are more accessible than they've ever been. But then also there's a lot out there in the media. There are books like Save the Cat Writes a Novel. There's Masterclass that has like some great authors talking about their craft. The great courses gives you like college level writing classes that you would go to Princeton and Yale to get usually. And there are also podcasts on craft everywhere. Remember that when you get information, what you need to do is apply it. It doesn't help just to read it. You have to apply it, which means that you have to read. You have to read books, and then you have to analyze what these writers are doing that you like so much. And you have to write and edit yourself. Okay? So get the knowledge, but then make sure you apply it. And then one great way of doing that is to work with your peers. So join or form a writers group. And by a writers group, I don't mean something like a club, but something where it's like a gathering of six to eight people, smaller, 4, sure. But where you're reviewing each other's work and you're applying these analytical skills, and you're also letting other people critique your work, and you're getting that level of input. A couple of rules of thumb on that. If it's facilitated by a professional, it actually is better. I'm not just saying that because I facilitate writers groups, because they're all cool anyway, but because it really is true. Someone who can give you some structure, who has like done it before, and who can actually teach you the art of critiquing very quickly so it doesn't take you years to get the skills up, very, very helpful. Meet regularly. Review regularly, whether you have a facilitator or not. Make it like a disciplined part of your writing life, and have a structure. Too many of these classes, these writers groups turn into everybody getting together and having a fun time. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to advance your writing, and if you want to get some dev editing done on your books, you need to have a structure. You need to know what criteria you as a group are going to use to review the work and how you're going to do it. Then what you want to do is you want to cultivate your beta readers, right? These are the people who, when you have a full draft, are going to read you from beginning to end. And you want to do a few things. You're going to look for a good analytical reader. A good reader is important, and so you pay attention when you're in writers groups. In a group of 6, maybe 1 or 2 of them would be a very good beta reader for you. You need someone whose reading taste you like. You need someone who happens to read in your genre. You also want a writer usually, so that they can actually discuss craft, but that's not always the case. There are editors out there as well who don't write, who are excellent because they're editors. And there are also sometimes very, very good readers who don't write themselves, but who are such good high-level readers that they can talk analytically about work and how the work is actually hanging together. So no family under any circumstances. I come from a family of writers. All my siblings are writers. My mom's a writer. My aunt's a writer. Writers out of the wazoo. Never, ever get family to edit or even if they're very, very professionally accomplished. And then you can also go to the professionals. You can buy a full dev edit. You can get an editor to go from beginning to end with you. I charge for $3,000 for anything under 50,000 words, $5,000 for anything under 100,000 words. I usually don't do anything over 100,000, although one or two people have snuck through because they're like favorites. Unfortunately, the bad news is I'm not horrendously expensive. So in fact, according to the Right Life, I'm a little bit charging because it's 5,600 is their estimate for a 70,000 word book, 9,600 for a 120,000 word book. So it is a very, very, I understand, expensive endeavor, but it's because it's very labor intensive. So for a lot of people who don't want to invest such a huge chunk, a partial edit is also something that you might consider. You can often get one of these as part of a workshop or a consultation at a conference. So that's a good way of accessing it. Writer's Digest is now doing all these online webinars with agents and editors and some published authors teaching. And as an incentive for you to sign up, they give you a free, well, not free, but an included partial edit, some notes back from the person who's giving the webinar. So that's something that you might look into, a webinar that's in your genre, for example, where you might get 10 pages of critique back. Don't forget, your first pages are the most important pages. Those need to be so tight. So if you only have limited resources, focus them always on that first chapter. So first chapter plus synopsis is something that can be contracted, for a lower amount, or I often get requests for first 3 plus synopsis or query. This would put the client in a position to go and pitch the book. And the thought or the hope is that if that first submission is strong enough, the agent will think that it's worth her while to invest. And then a lot of times the agents have a lot of dev editing feedback to give you themselves. And then of course there's consultancies by the hour, in person, Zoom, at conferences. Very, very easy to find. If anybody who's ever taught anywhere, go to their website and you will see somewhere on their website usually their consultancy rate. Most authors, I hate to tell you guys this, but most authors must supplement their income beyond book sales. So most authors, certainly all freelance editors, and not unfortunately the in-house editors, because they're way too busy, but some agents even will give you consultancies by the hour. A little tip on that though, if an agent does consultancies by the hour, I would use them for the consultancy. I would not use them as an agent, okay? Because the good agents should be way too busy to do that. And then if you get into a facilitated writers group, then don't forget that that is a way of getting a dev edit, because you're actually getting, with the long form writers workshops that go on for, in fact, years, you're getting someone always giving you comments, always giving you feedback on your work as you go. So that's a summary slide of how to get started. And this is, oh, actually, before we come back for questions, this is my email address, which Doug can give you also. If you want the slides, drop me a line and I'll send you a PDF of them. But in the meantime, I will stop the share and then we have 25 minutes for questions. Anybody? You can wave at me. Katie, are you waving or are you asking me a question? She's just waving. All right. Anybody else?
I have a question.
I have a question. Everybody's muted.
No.
Oh, yeah, you can. Well, why don't you put your hand up? I'll call on you and then you can unmute yourself. And that's the easiest way to manage it. So Doug, you have a question? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, you talked about the template that a friend with 17 books. I'm just curious what that's all about, and is it something that's out there on the internet?
No, I think that she made it herself. It's very easy. It's just like she just used, I think, Pages is the, but I'm sure you can do it in Word. And she just set it up so that so that each page holds like 12-point type at a certain letting, certain margins that she just measured off like a novel. But it gives her a very quick read as to where the page turn is going to come.
Oh, okay.
And so if you're doing a thriller, it might be a good idea. But it is like the fine end of the craft here. Most people don't go that far, but she does go that far to see where her page turn is. And some people take page turns very, very seriously. I heard Pam Monroe's speak once, and she's one of the YA authors, like an A-list YA author. And she was asked, what's your main tip? Like, what's your biggest tip that explains the success of your writing? And she said, before I think about the book, before I think about anything else, I think about the page turn. Like, I've written, a standard page in MG, maybe 250 words. I've written 250 words. Is there something in there now that's going to make that flick happen? Another 250, something else that will make that flick happen. So.
Good, thank you.
Anybody else?
Shirin,
Hey.
I have a question.
Ooh.
Those of us that aren't on video can't raise our hands. So
you can use the little if you click participants, you'll see all the names. And then next to your name, there's a more button. You can actually raise your hand there and I can see you. You see that?
Shirin?
Yeah?
thank you.
Okay.
There's also a
Katie
button
Pye.
for reactions that you
All
can
right.
use. The button reactions, and it's got a thumbs up or a hand. You can use the little hand wave too.
Okay. Katie Pye, did you have a question?
I do. Can you use this, some of this for nonfiction? Are developmental editors good for, development editors good for nonfiction books as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Nonfiction gets dev edited. Both memoir and straight nonfiction, how-to cookbooks, anything. The individuals are different though. So I have some dev editing friends who only do fiction, some who do both, some who only do nonfiction. So the skill set is slightly different, and the things that you look for slightly different.
Sure.
And then with what I call true nonfiction, like not memoir, but you're writing a book about how to reduce bullying in schools or something like that. A lot of times those books are sold before the book is fully written. So the editor actually helps put together the proposal and how to frame the book, but does not help so much in the writing of the book. By that time, usually it's sold onto a publishing company, and the publishing company turns around and assigns an editor to that book.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Lou?
Yeah, I just want to say about your wall full of Post-its.
Oh, yes.
I wrote a book, Solomon's Net. It's a novel I just put out, but I used some software. Can I share my, let's see, can I share?
I don't know. Doug is in charge of, is screen share allowed by everyone, Doug?
Yeah.
Is it? Okay, well, Catherine's saying yes.
Yeah, it does say any one participant, so.
Hide self-view, edit profile, rename, pin video, mute my audio.
So do you have a link?
Share screen, got it.
You could also post it to chat if there's.
No, hang on, let me see. There it is. Do you see that?
Nope.
Oh, okay. So it's not working then. Anyhow, what I was going to say is I used some software, a very old software that I used to use for analyzing complex systems. And each chapter was actually a hyperlink to the details of the chapter, but each chapter flowed into the next chapter, and I could decide what information was going to go into each one. you probably did that with the Post-its, but there's software that allows you to do that too. They're called concept mapping or mind mapping software.
Mm-hmm. I use a mind mapping software called MindNode to like write in the initial stages of drafting my book. I didn't actually use it once I started really writing, but right in the beginning, I found it really useful to like just do a mind dump and put down all the scenes that were rummaging around somewhere in my head, and then to use the mind mapping software to kind of organize my scenes and see what I had, which parts needed to be imagined out more deeply. Yeah, so I agree. Yes.
Shirin, in the chat, Leslie Walquist asks, why did you say never, never let family read your work?
Because I don't think that they can actually be, I think that family is, for the same reason that I would never say, oh, well, I'm an accomplished editor, I can read my own work. I'm just too close. So I wouldn't let family do it either because they're too close. I think that they're going to be biased one of either two ways. Either they're going to think that everything that you write is better than it actually is, or else they're going to think that everything that you write is not as good as it actually is. So I would leave it to people with a little bit more distance. Anybody else?
I would just add that I've experienced that close friends are often not very good or helpful either. I mean, depending how close, they could be too much like family.
Yeah, and also
just what you just said, Shirin.
Yeah, I agree with you. Unless you're very lucky to have friends who are writers and who have been who have been writing for long enough that they have the whole critiquing thing down, right? So I'm very lucky in that my best friends are all they're all novelists. So I trust them to be able to give me input that is not too far filtered by their personal feelings for me, either good or bad. But I kind of trust them to use their professional judgment much more. But I've been unlucky in that I can access these professional writers who have been critiquing for years. You know, I often say to people when I first started facilitating writers groups, or doing it as part of a course, you would see so many writers try to get out of the critiquing. You know, they would do shonky things like turn up on the days where they were being critiqued and then not turn up on the days where they had to give input. And you're just shortchanging yourself. The best way to learn how to write is to learn how to critique. You can't critique yourself because you're too close. So you have to learn how to critique other people. And in honing those skills, you sharpen the writing skill. It's the best way to learn how to write is to learn how to critique. So if you ever get into a writer's group, just remember the big learning is not when you're getting critiqued. The big learning is when you're doing it for other people. Katie?
Two things. One, I agree with you totally. That's what certainly did the most for me, was being in a critique group and getting my manuscript critiqued. But in terms of writing software, Scrivener is reasonably priced and gives you a lot of flexibility in the things that you can do. It also will save all your background materials and whatever, and also throw stuff into at the end into publishing if you're doing self-publishing. And I just forgot the second one. Anyway, that was Scrivener if you're interested in software. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I have a totally non-writing, but a very well-read husband who said to me the other day, I said, oh, I have to export it and then I have to reformat it. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I don't write in Word, you know, I write in Scrivener. And he said, why? And I started describing all these wonderful things that I do with Scrivener, because it has so many features that I use, and it just populates my novel in a certain way. And when I finished this description, he said to me, well, how much does that cost? I think that he was getting ready to disapprove. And I said, oh, I got it for $30. And he shut up. He's like, oh, that's really good. It's so funny. But it's a very powerful software for very little money. And it takes some getting used to, but once you're on it, you'll never go back.
Yeah. Except it doesn't work great on PCs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they have a PC version, and it lost everything for me. So, yeah. But I used to use it all the time, and then I switched to Write It Now.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's one of those, which is great, but you still have to put it in Word and then reformat because it doesn't do tabs very well.
Well, I don't think that Scrivener is great on formatting either, but it's just worth running through and doing the formatting for all the other things that it brings, for sure.
The one thing I found about the writing apps is that it does give you a storyboard, so you can take things, you can move a chapter, to move chapter 3 to the chapter 2 position, it's just a click.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives you each scene, so you can name the scenes and go back to it and move the scenes around. So from that standpoint, it's fabulous.
Yeah, so Scrivener lets you start a new, I don't have a word for it, but a new section. And I use it for scenes. So every scene, sometimes they're only one little paragraph long, but every scene is a new one. Then I can juggle them all over the place. The most useful thing is that I have at the bottom of my long list of scenes, at the bottom, I have a folder called Parking Lot. And I regularly just go whoop, and pull the whole scene into the parking lot. And then I feel I haven't wasted all that time. It's still there. I might need it in the future. I'll put it back out again. But it makes the editing much easier, because if you don't, in Word, where you have to delete it, oh my God, that's hard, right? You just spend all this blood and guts writing that, you're going to delete it? No, in Scrivener, I'm not deleting it. I'm just moving it over into this nice little folder until I'm ready to know what to do with it. And it makes it so much easier. And then I also was writing a novel that needed me to keep track of many different things. And there's a right-hand panel where you can store notes, and you can toggle between notes that apply to the entire project and notes that only apply to the scene that you're working on. So in my project notes, I had things like, don't forget that when you use longhouse is one word, not two. When you do this, you spell it this way. They're different spelling variations. All that on that level, plus things like don't lose young Joe. He's a minor character, but he's important, and you're going to lose him if you go too far without remembering that he exists. And then on the scene by scene, I would, because it handles photographs and imagery as well as words, I would just, for example, if I was describing her putting up on a hat, I would just paste in my picture of the hat, so that every time I describe that hat, I know exactly what hat I'm talking about, and I don't trip myself up with little inconsistencies. So, and all of that is just kept for you so seamlessly. Whereas with Word, you would either have this document that you'd have to clean up before you were ready to publish, or you would be running two documents side by side. So Scrivener just gives you this extra flexibility. And I should have bought shares in Scrivener before we started. All right, anybody else? I can't have been that thorough. You must have some questions about dev editing. You? Well, ask me something else. So how many of you are in writers groups by a show of hands? So that's less than half at the moment. My advice to you guys, to the rest of you, is try and get into a writers group. I was very resistant myself. I didn't really I was like, oh, my writing is so private. It really changes, it accelerates how much you learn so quickly if you get into a good group. So my tip for success, find a writer's group. And you're in the right part of the planet. Like right now, everyone, it's all COVID, but you know, what I loved about living in Fort Bragg is that everyone and their dog writes up there, right? It's you turn around. I said that to my mom once. I said, you can test it. We'll sit down for dinner. I'll ask the waitress. And so the waitress came over and I said, do you write by any chance? And she said, oh no, I don't, but my husband does. And you know, she was talking about what her husband does. You're in the best community, such a great community of artists and writers that you should get some little baby writers groups going. Okay. Well, I guess, did I stop recording? No. I guess I'll stop recording now then. Say goodbye.
Thank you so much, Shirin. Boy, I've got pages and pages of notes too, so it was really fun to take notes and great information. So in fact, I look forward to visiting the recording because I think it was just wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome. And Doug, I will be in touch with you because I don't know what to do with this recording now.
Okay.
I'll have to get it over to you somehow.
Yep.
And also I wanted to remind folks that September 20th is, we have Matali Perkins speaking on dialogue and crafting conversations in fiction. And also just remind people again, so Doug sends out the newsletter at least about a week before the meetings, and you know, remind folks they have to click and register. So yeah, I had about 5 texts while we were at meetings, you know, someone saying, where's my ID? How do I log on? And so anyway, we'll keep working on that.
That's right.
Well, happy writing, everyone. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.
Bye.